There are silences in Oxford that cannot be found elsewhere, not even in its libraries. A particular kind of hush exists just before Matins in the old college chapels, when the air itself seems to pause and hold its breath between chime and chant. It isn't reverent, not exactly. More like the silence of expectation, or guilt. I remember that morning not for what it held, but for what it didn't. No birdsong, though the square was lined with trembling sycamores. No scrape of chair legs beneath the choir stalls, and, most unusually, no Marchant. Dr. Hugh Marchant was punctual in the same way some men are tall or short, not by decision, but by condition. He wore punctuality like a waistcoat, tight-buttoned and slightly moth-eaten. His absence at Matins in St. Sed's Chapel did not cause a scene, not at first. Dons, even the most fretful, are well trained in the art of appearing unworried, but one could feel the perturbation shift like weather through the stone. I had not yet been summoned. I was still in bed, truth be told, listening to the tail end of a Chopin etude echoing through the walls of my flat. The radio was tuned too low, and I hadn't quite the will to rise and fix it. There are days when one feels one's soul like an overripe plum, dark, sweet, and sagging under its own weight. It was Strange who rang, brusque as ever. Head of college wants discretion, not uniforms. Morse, if you can stir yourself from your piano stool. That sort of thing. When I arrived at St. Sed's, the porter greeted me with a forced brightness that frayed at the edges. An older man, Jenkins I believe, with a moustache trimmed so neatly it looked penciled on. He ushered me into the loggia and then, almost as an afterthought, offered me the porter's logbook. He said it had been damaged, tea, apparently, and proffered a damp cloth like a bandage. Only one entry had blurred. Marchant's return to college the night before, just after Compline. A line of ink smeared diagonally across the time column, as though someone had shut the book too quickly in irritation or haste. I asked if anyone had seen Marchant since. Jenkins hesitated. He had been on duty until midnight, he said, and no one had come out through the main gate. He hadn't checked the cloister doors. They were meant to remain bolted at night. I walked slowly through the east cloister, my shoes muted on the worn flagstones. It had rained earlier, just enough to deepen the colour of the stone without leaving puddles. A place for secrets to sink rather than float. Marchant's rooms, high in the southeast turret, had already been unlocked by a junior fellow named Lambert, a narrow man with eyes like unfinished equations. He had the air of someone who never laughed, but who often noticed when others did. He handed me a list of items Marchant had supposedly taken with him, which was curious, given we still believed him within the college walls. A habit of mind, perhaps, or a preemptive fiction. The rooms themselves were the expected mess of scholarship and aesthetic affectation. Heavy curtains, dusty tomes, a bust of Erasmus gazing upward as though regretting all Latin ever uttered. On Marchant's desk, a crossword puzzle torn from the Times lay incomplete, its central clue circled twice in blue. I remember it precisely. Shrinking from faith, one heads to doubt. 8. Something in it pinched. A sealed envelope rested on a book of essays, Middlemarch as it happened, annotated in a woman's hand. The envelope bore only the initial A. I asked Lambert about it. He looked away and said nothing useful. Outside the chapel, the bell began to ring for midday prayers. It was not a cheerful sound. Bells in Oxford are never entirely joyful. They mark too many ends and too few beginnings. I stood beneath the archway and listened. The sound echoed strangely, as though something were absorbing it deep within the stone. And I remember thinking, not for the first time, that there are kinds of absence more present than any presence. Dr. Marchant had vanished. That much was clear. The question, as always, was whether he had meant to. There are men who take great comfort in ledgers, in ruled lines, in the steady drip of ink that transforms chaos into record. The porters of Oxford are among them, part priest, part gatekeeper, part silent archivist of the comings and goings of a city that pretends not to move. Jenkin, or perhaps it was Jenkin's twin in attitude, if not name, had shown me the logbook with a grimace meant to resemble an apology. The page for the night before had buckled slightly, the ink bleeding like bad news through damp parchment. I'd seen far worse, but I did not say so. I asked who had spilled the tea. He said the junior porter. I asked the junior porter. He said the wind had caught the page as he passed with a tray. I didn't believe either, not entirely. The stain was too deliberate in its sabotage, a long diagonal smudge that obscured only one line with surgical clumsiness. Marchant, 10:41 p.m. Nothing before or after had been touched. People forget how revealing a ruined record can be. We assume destruction is chaos, but sometimes it's a design. I let the porter show me the staff duty rota, as though it might compensate for the loss. Lewis arrived, hair damp from the drizzle, and offered one of his more apologetic shrugs. No one had seen Marchant leave the college. No cabs ordered. No gatekeeper logged him out. I asked again about the eastern cloister. Were the doors bolted? The senior porter looked momentarily affronted. Always, sir. Tradition and policy both. I refrained from asking when tradition had last been checked. We took the east path together. Lewis peered into corners. I peered at nothing in particular. The light in Oxford at that hour is bruised, neither morning nor memory. Marchant's rooms, revisited, gave up no new ghosts, but the air had changed. Slightly mustier, though the windows remained shut. A faint aroma of old lavender clung to the curtains, something left over from a visitor perhaps, or a bottle uncorked long ago. The crossword remained on the desk. I found my eyes drifting back to it. Shrinking from faith, one heads to doubt. The clue's symmetry gnawed at me. 8 letters, apostate? Perhaps. But the A was already penciled in from a different direction, intersecting with a clue I hadn't yet considered. Lewis remarked on a missing key. The upper drawer of the desk wouldn't open. It might have been locked, or it might have jammed from swelling in the damp. A metaphor, too obvious for me to pursue. Back downstairs, I examined the porter's station more closely. On the shelf above the tea tins was a stack of unused ledgers. The topmost had dust disturbed only at one corner. I opened it casually. Blank, but the next was not. 3 pages torn out at the back. The ragged edges spoke of haste, not bookkeeping. I didn't ask about them. I simply tucked the observation away like a loose thread in a familiar jacket. Lambert passed through the archway as we returned. He nodded without warmth. I noted the absence of surprise in his eyes, which is always its own kind of signal. Lewis asked if I thought Marchant had left under his own steam. I said nothing, then corrected myself. He left, yes, but not necessarily outward. Sometimes the exit is inward, through silence, through absence, through an erased name in a book that was meant to remember you. And sometimes the ledger lies, not in what it says, but what it forgets to say. There are voices that stay with you long after the music has ended, not because they were perfect, but because they failed in interesting ways. A half-breath too soon, a tremble on the higher notes, a sorrow nestled in the phrasing. Helen Braithwaite's was such a voice. A mezzo-soprano with neither range nor brightness, but with something else, a haunted patience, that made the psalms feel older than the stone they echoed from. I found her folding robes in the dim vestry, the kind of dimness that encouraged reflection or lies depending on the hour. She said she wasn't surprised by Marchant's absence, though she said it softly, as if trying not to wake the stained glass. He'd been strange of late, distracted during rehearsal. He'd corrected a line in the Vespers reading, but not the way one corrects a mistake, more like someone trying to unring a bell. He said something odd to her afterward. That guilt was a kind of liturgy. That forgiveness had nothing to do with it. I asked if he'd been drinking. She gave me a look, not unkind. "No more than you, Inspector." Outside the rain had lightened, but the sky remained heavy. That pale English heaviness that doesn't descend, only lingers. I offered to walk her home. She declined, then changed her mind, said her umbrella had turned inside out. We walked past the cloister, garden where the daffodils had begun to push up through the soil. Too early for them, but Oxford never fully obeyed the seasons. Helen moved slowly, her bag slung low on her shoulder like a satchel from another time. She asked me if I believed people could disappear intentionally, not into death necessarily, just away. I said Oxford was full of people who had. She paused at the quad gate, then turned back. She mentioned a quarrel, something overheard rather than witnessed. A raised voice, Marchant's, but not anger. Desperation, perhaps, a kind of pleading. She didn't hear the reply, only silence after. In her flat, a third-floor perch above a bookshop on Turl Street, she brewed something herbal and insisted on playing me a fragment of the Saint Ced's Easter service from the previous year. On cassette, of course. The hiss of the tape sounded like wind through pine. "That's him," she said, as a single male voice led the responsory. I listened. The note was flat, not musically but spiritually, as though the man singing no longer believed in what he was saying. On her shelf, among the predictable theology texts, was a novel I hadn't expected. The sea, margin-worn and ribbon-marked, I asked. She smiled. "It reminds me how foolish we are when we think we've outgrown our own madness." I asked if Marchant ever gave her books. "Just the one," she said. "Years ago. A hymn book, plain-bound. She brought it down from the shelf." I flicked through the brittle pages and found the inscription. "To the one who knows how silence sins. No name, no date. Just those words in Marchant's firm, angular script." "It wasn't quite love," she said. "But it could have been once." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. As I left, I asked about Marchant's last confession. Her smile vanished into something thinner. "He told me he was tired of hiding things in plain sight," she said. On the walk back to the station, I kept thinking about the line from the responsory. "The Lord shall guide thee continually." But Marchant had sounded unconvinced, as though even divine guidance had gone astray. In the station locker, I placed the hymn book carefully in the evidence drawer, not for its value, but for the questions it raised. I thought of the crossword again, shrinking from faith. Apostate, 8 letters, the clue fit. But Marchant hadn't solved it. He'd circled it twice, which meant he'd known the answer, but hadn't written it down, perhaps because he was still deciding. It has always struck me that certain stones in Oxford remember more than others. The cloister slabs at St. Ced's are among them, uneven, whispered over by centuries of feet, yet bearing only the faintest signs of wear. Still they speak, if one listens properly. I had returned that morning to examine the east cloister in solitude before the traffic of dons and chapel girls could trample over the night's secrets. The fog hadn't lifted entirely. It hung about the arches, like smoke that refused to be named. I knelt, not reverently, but with the slow reluctance of a man whose joints have begun to mutter. There, near the vestry door, were scuff marks. 2 shallow arcs and a patch of discoloration that might have meant nothing to anyone else, but I'd seen it before, the peculiar heel drag of leather shoes on damp limestone. Someone had paused here, pivoted, then disappeared inward. The vestry itself was a study in quiet denial. All oils and dust and polished brass, a sanctuary for things that needed no explanation. The sacristy cupboard yielded nothing but folded surplices and an incongruous tin of barley sugars. But beside the organ bench, beneath a faded tapestry of St. Sebastian, there was a trap door. It wasn't locked. They rarely are, these remnants of older architecture. Below was a storage space, large enough to lose someone in should the need arise. The air was close, unused, or used only for things one didn't want remembered. Wine racks lined one wall, most empty, some labelled with decades rather than vintages. A few stacked chairs, a dusty lectern. But what caught me wasn't the clutter. It was the patch of carpet in the far corner, laid out like a rug in a forgotten parlour. It was too clean, too centred. I bent to lift it. Beneath, stone, unmarked, undisturbed. But the rug itself, a crimson and gold pattern, didn't match the rest. It had come from somewhere else, perhaps somewhere more personal. Lewis called down. A visitor had arrived, Dr. Brian E. Tilling. We met in Marchant's study. She carried her discomfort like a handbag, lightly but always with her. Academic in the classical sense, too clever to be direct. I offered her tea. She declined. I asked about her history with Marchant. We were close once, she said, in that brittle tone that suggests the memory has yellowed at the edges. Before either of us knew how damaging proximity could be. She picked up a paperweight on the desk, a globe cracked along the equator. He'd grown strange in recent months. Obsessive, she said, not about the chapel, about something older. A photograph, she thought, a letter he wouldn't name. She didn't know more, or pretended not to. She glanced at the crossword still lying on the blotter. Apostate, she said softly. I used to teach that word. I asked what it meant to her. Someone who leaves not out of disbelief but disappointment. I watched her leave through the quad, her steps measured, coat tight against the wind. Back in the cloister, I tried to retrace the footsteps. One pair, leading inward, none leading out. It was a fact so simple it refused to declare itself important, like a clock that ticks slightly out of rhythm but keeps time all the same. Marchant had entered this place after Compline. That much we knew. But no one had seen him leave. I turned back toward the vestry. Perhaps he hadn't. The college registry lives in a room that smells of aging glue and failed intentions. A scent I've always found oddly reassuring. There's something comfortingly pathetic about the belief that a name, once recorded in ink, will stay fixed in time. Oxford knows better. Even the firmest entries blur with enough memory. The senior administrator, Miss Devlin, met me in that hush particular to rooms full of forgotten files. She spoke in the manner of someone who'd spent too many years learning how not to intrude on the reputations of men who wore robes. I asked about Marchant's records. Financial, personal, disciplinary. She hesitated, then produced a slim manila folder, slimmer than I expected for a man whose tenure predated most of the trees in the quad. Inside were bursary notes, a few typed evaluations of student progress, and a copy of his latest sabbatical request, unsigned, curious that. But what drew my attention was the financial ledger attached at the back. Marchant had made a substantial withdrawal from his discretionary endowment just 3 weeks prior, 50% of his available funds. I asked Devlin what he might have used it for. She said he'd mentioned renovations. I asked which rooms. She couldn't recall him specifying. She looked away then, toward the narrow window, and I let her. Down the hall, past the painted shields and glass cabinets of commemorative goblets, there was a file misfiled, or so it appeared, a soft leather envelope bound with a green ribbon that frayed at the edge. The label read Marchant, H, Private. It had no right to be there. The handwriting was not Devlin's. Inside an old photograph, 5 men in robes, unsmiling, standing before what looked like a garden wall, a hint of ivy, a blurred sundial, no year printed, just a faint pencil note on the back, Michaelmas term. One face I recognized, Marchant, in the center. Another stirred something deeper. Back in my office, I rummaged through an older case file, one I'd never quite managed to let go of. It took time, but there it was, a clipping, yellowed and folded into thirds. Disgraced theologian, plagiarism scandal, left country. The photo beside the article had been cropped awkwardly, but the mouth matched. The third man in the group. I placed the 2 images side by side. The years between them had stolen the certainty from the eyes, but not the shape of guilt. Lewis appeared in the doorway with a cup of coffee I hadn't asked for. He looked at the photographs, then at me. He said nothing for a while. Eventually, he asked if it was relevant. I told him relevance is often a trick of chronology. We visited Marchant's rooms again, the same stillness, the same faint scent of dried oranges and failing radiators. Lewis poked about the wardrobe, found nothing but coats and an old clerical stole folded in the top drawer. I turned again to the desk. The blotter still bore the impression of a letter long gone. The indentations faint but legible under angled light. I took a pencil from my coat and lightly shaded the surface. Words rose like bruises from beneath the leather. You cannot protect what no longer exists. In the lower drawer, beneath a sheaf of unread essays, I found a solicitor's note, crumpled, unsigned. The name of a firm I recognized, conservative, discreet. The letter referenced a bequest, revisions to be made urgently, not to delay. It had been dated 5 days before Marchant's disappearance. Outside, the clouds had grown heavier. Not threatening rain exactly, more like a ceiling slowly lowering itself over the dreaming spires. I returned to the registry, thanked Miss Devlin, and paused at the doorway. Behind her desk, high on the wall, hung the college's roll of fellows, varnished wood, names etched in gold. Marchant's was there, clear, fixed, but the space beneath it, where future names would be carved, remained blank. And I wondered if that emptiness wasn't somehow the most honest thing in the room. I've never much trusted men who speak of God with certainty. There's something too brittle in their tone, as if belief, once spoken too firmly, risks shattering under its own weight. The Bishop of Oxford, however, wore his faith like a second skin, not flashy, not ornamental, simply there, as though doubt had visited him often but never stayed long enough to unpack. We met in his private library above the cathedral offices, a room that smelt of candle wax and vellum and a kind of earned loneliness. He poured the tea himself without ceremony and asked if I still listened to Wagner. I told him less than I once had, but more than I should. He smiled at that, then lowered himself into an armchair that had clearly been formed around his spine over decades. He knew why I was there, of course. Marchant. The bishop tapped a finger absently on the saucer. Hugh was meant to take orders once, bright, trembling with conviction. But something... He paused, choosing the word like a man rifling a hymnal. Something undid that. He didn't elaborate, so I didn't ask. These things are often better left outlined in silence. Instead, he reached behind him and produced a slim booklet, a private printing of meditations, Marchant's. Scribbled years ago, forgotten, then mailed back to the bishop 3 weeks earlier with a short note. For the record, should it matter? I leafed through it slowly. Meditations on guilt, forgiveness, and absence. The writing was precise, almost legalistic in places, but there was poetry too. A line stayed with me. The soul seeks its wound the way the tongue returns to a broken tooth. The bishop pointed to the final page, a poem, unsigned. 4 stanzas in loose translation from Dante. References to false gates and doors disguised as altars. I read it twice. Something unsettled me. On the walk back to St. Sed's, I found myself retracing older routes, streets I'd walked as a student, then again as a detective, and now, I suppose, as something between the two. Experience carves strange repetitions into our lives. In the college dining hall, a portrait hung of a former warden, long dead, long defamed. The paint had faded unevenly, leaving the mouth in sharp relief, a tight, unreadable line. I stood there longer than I meant to. Lewis joined me without speaking. He'd been reading over the financials again. Marchant's withdrawal, he said, had been split into 2 separate transfers. One to a building contractor in Headington, the other, curious this, to a theological publisher in Devon. The same press, as it happened, that had printed the bishop's booklet. I said nothing. Instead, I walked back to Marchant's rooms. The window overlooked the old cloister. Below, the shadows were growing long and disjointed. I returned to the drawer with the crossword. A thought occurred. The clue, shrinking from faith, one heads to doubt. I'd been too focused on the theological reading, but shrinking, a tailor's term or a psychological one. I ran my finger down the page, counting letters, 8 across, already circled twice, unsolved. Then quietly I saw it. Apostate, yes, or the obvious answer. But beneath it, another clue, faint and unmarked. 6 down, unquiet scholar, once cloaked, now raw. 6. I whispered it aloud. March. Not a solution, a gesture, a signature. The bishop had said Marchant trembled with conviction, but perhaps it had always been a tremble of fear. There are certain hours in Oxford when the architecture stops pretending to be eternal and simply becomes old. Cracks in sandstone betray the weight of secrets carried too long. The stained glass doesn't shimmer with sanctity. It warps, flickers, distorts. It was during such an hour that I found the chaplain rearranging the hymn boards, not by candlelight, as one might expect from fiction, but under the erratic flick of an electric bulb nearing its end. I hadn't meant to startle him, though I did. His hands, holding the slats, stiffened. One slipped and clattered to the floor with a wooden finality. He said he was correcting an error. Last Sunday's number had been repeated. I asked what had been sung. He couldn't recall at first, then muttered something about Rock of Ages. I asked whether Marchant had come to confession recently. The chaplain hesitated, then said that such things were private. I said yes, but privacy has degrees, and Marchant, by all accounts, had been loosening his tongue in strange corners of late. We sat then, not quite in pews, but on the bench by the vestry door. The chaplain was a man of brittle kindness, too delicate for the students, too vague for the dons, and now too wrung out for diplomacy. He confessed that Marchant had indeed sought him out, not regularly, not formally, but they had spoken. About fear, about how the weight of memory becomes unbearable only when no one else shares it. He said Marchant had seemed convinced that something, or someone, was returning. I asked, a student? Oh, former fellow? A ghost? He said Marchant never clarified, only that he'd read something that had made him ill, a paper, a thesis. A voice from the past returned to accuse. The phrase stuck with me, a thesis. Later, in the Bodleian archives, I requested a restricted folder, dissertations marked for internal reference only. It took an hour and the librarian's reluctant smile, but eventually I held it. A bound volume. Theology and contradiction. Refractions of sin in post-lapsarian texts. Marchant's notes filled the margins. I recognized the handwriting, spidery and insistent. He hadn't read it passively. He had engaged it, wrestled with it. But halfway through, the commentary ceased. The final pages were untouched, as if the voice in the text had finally grown too loud. There was, however, a postscript, written in an unfamiliar hand and inserted on separate paper. A single line, "We all choose which gospel to bury." I sat for a long time after reading it. There are sentences that don't reveal meaning so much as undo something in you. Back at St. Sed's, I walked the length of the cloister again. The rain had begun in earnest. It fell not in sheets, but in questions. From the chapel steps, the stained glass looked different, backlit now by the diffuse grey of late afternoon. I studied the west window, the oldest, a depiction of Christ before Pilate. The eyes in the glass had always seemed a touch too human. Only then did I notice it. In the lower left quadrant, beneath the crowd of onlookers, a figure knelt, hooded, not part of the biblical scene, a later addition perhaps, or an indulgent flourish from a glazier with ideas. But something about the angle, the suggestion of concealment, unsettled me. In Marchant's rooms again, I returned to the drawer that held the hymn books. They were in order, dusty, except one, slightly misaligned, thinner. A print run from the 1970s. I opened it. In the front, a library slip, long expired. And in the back, between the Psalms and the doxologies, an envelope. Unsealed, a letter. It was a draft, unfinished, addressed to H. The writing was tight, furious. You think because you held the keys, you were the gate. But some gates never closed, and some sins outlast belief. No name signed, just a date, 3 weeks ago. I folded it carefully, replaced the envelope, and walked out into the drizzle. From the tower, the bells marked the hour, but not precisely. They were off, just slightly, a beat too slow. I listened anyway. Even the wrong bells have meaning. Some truths arrive dressed as stammers. They enter rooms reluctantly, heads lowered, shoes damp with nerves. The choir girl, Frances, or Frankie, as she'd written on the crumpled note slid beneath my office door, was barely 16 and looked younger still in the overlarge college coat someone had lent her. We met in the music rehearsal room, that strange hybrid of echo and silence. A piano waited in the corner, closed, and, slightly out of tune, dust shimmered like lost breath in the morning light. She didn't speak right away. I didn't ask questions. I simply sat, elbows on knees, watching the cracked varnish of the music stands, the way they bowed as if burdened by too many scores never quite performed. Eventually, she told me she hadn't meant to eavesdrop. She had gone back for her umbrella, a hideous thing with a duck's head handle, which she retrieved from her rucksack as proof, as if I might doubt her otherwise. She had opened the vestry door just as the voices rose, one sharp with pleading, the other lower, colder. She recognized Marchant's voice. She said he sounded tired, not physically, but like someone worn down to the outlines. He said, "Please not here." The other voice replied, "You've sung your last matins." Then silence. No crash, no thud, no scream, just a sort of swallowed finality, as if the chapel itself had closed its throat. She had stepped back then, waited, but no one came out. She didn't see anyone leave. Only later, after the rain had begun, did she slip away. I asked why she hadn't told anyone. She looked at the floor, then at her hands, because I thought maybe he wanted to disappear. Outside, the bells marked noon with an unusual grace, I'd forgotten it was Wednesday, evensong rehearsal day. I thanked her, not with words, just a nod, held a second too long. She nodded back. After she left, I sat at the piano, ran my fingers along the keys without pressing down. Even silence carries melody, if you know how to hear it. Back in the vestry, I examined the trapdoor again. It opened with the same reluctant creak. The cellar air was denser this time, or perhaps it was me. I moved slowly. Light pooled faintly from the square window near the ceiling, mottled with grime. Then I saw it. Not a body, nothing so conclusive. A wooden crucifix, no longer on the wall above the wine rack. It had been wrapped hastily in linen and placed beneath a broken chair. The cloth was church issue, embroidered at the corner. But there was something more, a stain, not dramatic, not theatrical, just a pale rust smear across the fabric. It might have been wine, it might not. I left it untouched. Some relics lose their meaning when handled. Back in Marchant's rooms, I noticed something I hadn't before. A slip of paper folded into the hymnal he always kept by the bedside. Not a prayer, not a confession, just a word, Exodus. In pencil, barely legible. A choice, perhaps, or a plea. I don't know. None of us ever do until long after the bells have stopped ringing. There are names that vanish from registries, but not from memory. They linger at the edges of faculty lists, erased but not quite gone, like half-forgotten verses in a hymn you once sang with conviction. The man I sought had once stood beside Marchant in a photograph, shoulder to shoulder, in borrowed robes, both smiling without their eyes. His name was Jacob Wren. He had left Oxford. Under the shroud of disgrace and speculation, neither expelled nor exonerated. Plagiarism, the file said. But the evidence had been circumstantial, the kind that leaves a bruise without breaking the skin. Some believed the accusations were politically motivated, others whispered something quieter, that Marchant had been the architect of his fall. The truth, like most things here, had been buried under formal language and long silences. It took time to trace him. He had slipped through the cracks, not loudly but deliberately. No degree, no forwarding address, but literature leaves a trail, a series of translations of obscure medieval texts published under a different name, same cadence, same obsessive footnotes. He was living under the name Julian Reed now, in a second-floor flat above a shuttered bookshop in Jericho. The stairs creaked as I climbed, though I took them slowly. Rain had begun to fall, that fine Oxford mist that sinks into tweed and thought alike. He answered the door with a cautious stillness, the kind one learns from living too long in a world waiting to reopen old wounds. I told him who I was. He didn't seem surprised. He let me in without asking why I'd come. The flat was a study in self-containment, sparse, books in tidy piles, a kettle, a window left open despite the rain. There was a bruise on his forearm, half hidden beneath a rolled shirt sleeve. He caught me looking, said it was nothing. We spoke quietly. He said Marchant had come to him, not long ago, the first time in decades, said he looked ill, not physically exactly, but as if his centre had hollowed out. They'd spoken for an hour about absolution, about the past not staying past. He'd brought an envelope with him, left it behind. Jacob, or Julian I suppose, crossed to the desk and retrieved it. Inside was a scrap of parchment, faint lines written in Latin, not scripture, a riddle almost, but one Marchant had penned himself. Veritas vincit omnia. Truth conquers all. I asked why he hadn't come forward. He said, because truth doesn't conquer. It waits. He offered me coffee. I declined. There was nothing more to say. On the walk back through the narrow lanes behind the canal, I found myself thinking not of Marchant, but of the boy who'd once stood beside him, full of untested brilliance, eyes bright with something not yet broken. somewhere along the way, that boy had vanished. Back at the station, I laid the parchment beside the crossword again. Something about the phrasing, the symmetry of it. I reread the clue, shrinking from faith, one heads to doubt, 8. Apostate, still fit. But I wondered if Marchant had meant it, not as a solution, but as a confession. Apostasy is rarely loud. It creeps in, through disappointment, through compromise, through the slow erosion of certainty. And sometimes it takes the form of a man returning quietly to the one he once betrayed, not for it was something Lewis said, quite by accident. We were walking back from the chapel, our coats damp and patience thinner. He was remarking on the strangeness of Marchant's absences, not just from services but from any lasting record. Said he'd noticed an oddity in the choir's attendance slips, that a hymn number had been logged twice, or maybe wrongly. A detail barely worth the breath it took to mention. But my ear, tuned less to volume than dissonance, caught it. Hymn number 343. I asked when it was listed. The night before Marchant vanished, Vespers, a Tuesday. I returned to the vestry alone, rain still in my collar. The ledger was where it always had been, curled slightly at the edges like a man who sleeps badly. Hymn 343, listed, then scratched out. Replaced in red ink with 345. I fetched the hymnals and opened to the original. Not Abide With Me, as expected, but something stranger, a setting rarely sung, The Hidden Door. A lyrical oddity. Lament disguised as praise. And someone had folded a church register within it. Not one from this term. It bore the watermark of 1972. The names were there, Marchant, Wren, and others I only half recognized from old lists. But one had been erased, not scratched out, removed with acid or time or care, and beside it, faint and barely legible, See Marchant file, copy retained, buried under hymnals. It was clever, almost charming, if one believed in such things. I took the register back to my flat, laying it on the piano lid like a reluctant score. I poured a measure of whiskey I didn't need and stared at the name that wasn't there. A ghost, or the closest thing Oxford allows to one, someone remembered only by the absence they left behind. There was a knock at the door, not official, a hand too polite, too uncertain. It was Helen Braithwaite. She had something folded in her coat pocket, something she hadn't wanted to bring, said she'd found it among Marchant's belongings. Unintentionally, of course. She had been given a box to sort through for the archives. A kindness, someone had said. She handed me a letter, dated last spring, addressed only to A. It wasn't a confession. Marchant hadn't believed in those. It was an apology of sorts, or a justification. He wrote about truth not being what one uncovers, but what one stops covering, and a line that stood out, drawn twice in the margin. We sang the wrong hymn, you and I, but the melody stays. Helen sat with me a while, her coat still on, her hands cold. We spoke about silence, how it grows louder the longer it's held. After she left, I reread the letter, and then the register, and then the hymn. Number 343. I realized something then. The mistake hadn't been in the listing, it had been in the correction. Someone had changed the hymn deliberately, hoping no one would notice. But the pages had been misaligned. The old register had slipped inside the altered book. The past, like truth, has a way of returning. Even when bound in linen and hidden beneath the floorboards, even when sung in the wrong key. I remember the light most of all, the way it slanted through the chapel windows as the choir took their places, slicing the dust into long golden corridors. It was a warm evening, unnaturally so for Oxford in spring. the sort of warmth that makes men uncomfortable in their collars and more likely to say what they ought not. The service began with a quiet note from the organ. Not a triumphal blast, but a low, uncertain hum, like someone remembering how to pray. The choir sang "If Ye Love Me," and I sat in the rear pew, the final words still echoing against the rafters when I stood. There are no formal gatherings in Oxford, only conversations that happen to include everyone at once. I had asked them to be there, the chaplain, Lambert, Miss Braithwaite, even Jacob Wren, not as suspects, as witnesses to something that had already happened. I stood, not at the altar, but by the lectern, the wood polished with generations of intention. My voice felt too loud at first, then not quite loud enough. I spoke not of guilt, but of absence. Of a man who had vanished not in the way of Houdini, but in the way of those who wish simply to be elsewhere. Marchant hadn't left the college. That was clear now. He had stayed, or been kept. I turned to Lambert. His face didn't change, but the knuckles of his right hand, always pale, had whitened. He had argued with Marchant. That much was known, witnessed, but it wasn't the first time. I recited the line from the letter again. You think because you held the keys, you were the gate. The chapel was silent. Lambert didn't deny it. He didn't confess either. He simply stood, said he'd warned Marchant, that the past couldn't be reopened without consequence, that Wren's return had unsettled everything, not because of what he'd done, but because of what Marchant hadn't. Miss Braithwaite spoke then, a single sentence. He wanted to be punished. Lambert laughed, a brittle, joyless sound, said Marchant had begged for silence, that he'd threatened to resign, to write it all down. There had been a struggle, he admitted. Not a violent one, not meant to harm, just enough to stop the words. Marchant had fallen, struck the corner of the vestry table. There had been blood, and then a kind of stillness that doesn't permit reversal. The rest, he said, was necessity. The cellar, the cloth, the crucifix, the rug, rituals of concealment. Lewis, standing behind the last pew, moved forward quietly. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Lambert stepped aside, not in guilt, but as if he'd finished reading his part in a liturgy. Outside, the bells began again, not the chapel ones, the city. I remained alone for a moment longer. The choir had gone, the pews empty, the light fading fast. I walked to the front and picked up the service sheet. Hymn 343 had been sung after all, the original, the hidden door. I folded the paper and slipped it into my coat. In the corner of the chapel beneath the window depicting St. Stephen, someone had left a candle burning, not for illumination, just because it seemed the right thing to do. The body was carried out just before dawn, not with ceremony, not even with quiet reverence. A plain trolley, 2 constables, and the sort of silence that follows a conclusion no one wanted, but everyone expected. The cellar had kept him well. Marchant. That strange, spare man with his half-finished sentences and finished regrets. No marks of violence beyond the bruise that undid him. A fall, perhaps, or the final collapse of a life lived balancing between forgiveness and concealment. I watched from the cloister arch as they wheeled him out. The sky had begun to bleed grey over the spires, that Oxford grey that never fully commits to weather or mood. Lewis stood beside me, arms crossed too tightly, as if holding something in. He asked whether I believed it had been murder, or simply a moment that turned the wrong way. I said nothing, because what mattered wasn't the intent. It was the silence afterward, the choices made once the breathing stopped. St. Sed's returned to itself with unnerving speed. By breakfast, the dining hall buzzed again. The porters kept the gate. A first-year spilled tea on a borrowed scarf. Chapel rehearsals resumed with slightly less vigour, slightly more whispering. Lambert had been taken quietly. He hadn't resisted, hadn't defended, just gone still, like a man who'd finally reached the end of his line in a crossword puzzle and found no more squares to fill. The bishop called later that afternoon, said he'd been rereading Marchant's Meditations, said something about grief being a form of punctuation. I didn't quite follow, but I understood there was a faculty meeting that evening. I didn't attend, I walked instead, past Radcliffe Square, past the Sheldonian, down Magpie Lane, where the stones remember different kinds of footsteps. I found myself back at the chapel, unlocked, empty. Inside, the pews held only dust. The air, though unburned, still held a hint of incense, or memory. I sat where Marchant had once sat, row 4, left side, a hymn book still marked with a folded ribbon. It fell open to number 343, The Hidden Door. I read the verses again. The third stanza spoke of gates mistaken for graves, and I thought, perhaps Marchant hadn't chosen to vanish, not entirely. Perhaps he had simply misread the architecture of his own guilt. A note had been left on the lectern, not addressed to anyone, just there. It was a schedule. Next term's evensong line-up. Marchant's name, in faded biro, still headed the column. No one had thought to erase it, or no one had dared. As I stood to leave, the bells began again, not the hourly clang. The other one, the soft, uncertain call that marked nothing at all. It rang once, then once more, off-tempo, out of time, like someone trying to remember a melody they used to know. I stepped out. The morning, that wasn't quite morning. The light was pale. The city still half dreaming. Behind me, the chapel remained. Still, but not empty. Never empty. Just filled now with the weight of things that had no proper name. And the bells kept ringing for no one, for everyone.